So yeah, as Alice said, I kind of essentially support voluntary sector organisations and community groups to articulate evidence and demonstrate the impact of their work. Now, this can be really helpful if you're kind of a large scale, massive organization like, I don't know, Oxfam or something, and you're looking to kind of get funding from massive corporate donors and other kind of, grants and foundations and things like that. But the principles behind exploring what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you expect to achieve your goals can be really, really useful, all the way down to kind of medium, small, micro organizations and even individuals as well. So a lot of kind of the basis and the underpinnings of what I'm going to talk about should be useful to everyone, basically. And it'll link a lot, I think, as well to some of the conversations that we're going to be having after the break around kind of project planning as well. So thinking about kind of how you want to do things and how you want to set yourself up for success, essentially. As Alice is in charge of the slides, I'm going to take a bit of a Chris Whitty approach. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. Didn't even need to say anything. That was seamless. So what I wanted to kind of present first, rather than kind of diving into lots of jargony type terms and stuff like that, I wanted to try and just kind of convey to you this concept of the learning cycle. So this is something that I'm sure you might have come across before. And if you haven't come across it, it's going to seem very, very obvious. But I think it's really worth reminding ourselves as to kind of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we can focus on improvement and learning. Because whatever we do, it's probably not going to work perfectly the first time round. So it's all about really thinking about how we can continually learn and improve from our work and feed back any kind of insights and learnings into what we're doing in order to try and have a larger impact and support those that we're kind of working with and for. So normally where you start, and I'm sure this is kind of, maybe you've already done a lot of this thinking, or maybe you're just beginning to think about it, is some kind of analysis of need. So essentially, you're going to be thinking about like, what's the problem? What's the issue? What thing have you thought about and realized needs resolving or addressing in some way, shape, or form? And there could be lots of different things on various different scales. It could be, you want some bike racks outside of your kind of, community hall. It could be that you're looking to kind of embark upon energy security. So you want to do some kind of like, community energy type program. It can be anything essentially. But what you'll have done is you'll have determined that there's an issue that you think needs addressing. And then often what you then kind of do is you invert that. So the issue is X, and what I want to do is basically the opposite. I want to address that issue in some way, shape, or form. I want to make some kind of difference that goes some way to addressing that. So you kind of determine what difference you want to make based often on kind of the opposite of the issue that you've identified. Once you've kind of figured out what the difference you want to make is, we kind of need to work backwards slightly and figure out what we're going to do to make that difference. And I'll talk a little bit more in a little bit more detail about that in just a second. But once you kind of determine what you're going to do and set about doing it and put the wheels in motion, it's really important to kind of track your progress and think about what you're doing, and monitoring how it's going, essentially through your kind of project process, tracking that progress. That's going to then give you the data, the insights, the knowledge that you need in order to kind of learn from your work and what you've done, what's worked well, what's worked less well. And that's going to enable you to make good, solid, evidence-based decisions as to what you want to do differently next time to improve your work, make it smoother, faster, better, more impactful, whatever it might be. And that kind of feeds you back into the top of the cycle. And this cycle just continues, it goes round and round and round. As I say, the best projects are often kind of iterative. There's something that you might have heard of as well called MVP. And I'm not talking about like the Super Bowl or anything like that. It's a minimum viable product. So essentially, a minimum viable product is just good enough to kind of get off the ground. We're not looking for a product that's perfect. We're not looking for a service that's perfect. We're just looking for something that we can kind of get going. Because what we need to do is to kind of get moving and get learning, basically, so that we can improve what we're doing faster and get to where we want to be faster. So those kind of like core design concepts of a minimum viable product can be really useful to kind of bear in mind. What we're looking to do isn't to kind of create the perfect project plan, the perfect project, the perfect activity, and then do it. We want to get started. And I know that a lot of you will be very keen to get going, get moving, and get things happening. So don't worry too much about having everything completely planned out perfectly beforehand. There's definitely a case to be made for just beginning and seeing what happens. But what I'm going to try and encourage you to do is to try and explore that middle ground, I think, between just launching into things and kind of planning, and not ever really getting started. Um, Alice, can I ask you to move to the next slide, please? So kind of why bother with this process? So there's kind of two main drivers really for wanting to kind of articulate and plan for impact. The first one is around kind of learning from the evidence and insights that you've gathered to kind of improve effectiveness and achieve more for those you're seeking to help. And the other one is more around kind of proving. So it's around kind of showing funders and supporters what you've achieved. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list that I've got here on the slide, but in a little more detail, some of the key reasons around kind of embarking upon this particular type of work can be around kind of exploring how you want to have an impact. And that can really help you focus your thinking and plan for how to use your resources, which naturally, by their very nature, will be limited. So other like-minded individuals, volunteers, people that want to get involved, you don't want to waste their time. You want to make sure that what you're doing is efficient. It can also help you identify where your work is most effective. So what worked particularly well, what might not have worked so well, what you might want to change or develop or iterate. And that can really help you make better decisions about your project, so you can make a bigger difference for the people and communities you're working with and for. Those funding or investing in kind of voluntary or community action increasingly are asking about the difference that you might have made. So kind of moving beyond just what you might have delivered. In other words, well, what are known as kind of outputs. So moving from outputs to outcomes, essentially. Outcomes just being those changes that you've kind of generated. So collecting evidence of those changes of your impact can also help build a really strong case to attract new or further funding, which can be very useful too. Evidence of impact can also be really useful to kind of help communicate with your key stakeholders. I know that some of you have already kind of spoken about kind of reaching out, communicating, and kind of gathering like-minded individuals together. So you can kind of share your progress, and that can really help to kind of engage other individuals, current and potential donors, but also it can kind of help increase public understanding around what you're doing and why you're doing it, and the impact that it's having, the positive changes that it's resulting in. That can really help kind of create this sea change and get people behind you and help you kind of magnify and scale up your impact, which can be really helpful. Also, kind of just finally, it can also help you become more accountable, more credible through recognizing that things can always be better, being open to feedback, and engaging in kind of a more systematic and meaningful process too. It's important not to focus too much on the proving part. Too much focus on kind of like looking to kind of prove and show how amazing what you're doing is, can often lead you to kind of eschew some of the kind of benefits around the kind of improving side. In other words, kind of only focusing on results or insights that kind of put you in the best possible light can cloud thinking around what you could do better. So worth bearing in mind. I've got one more slide, but before I move on to that slide, does anyone have any kind of questions or thoughts? Is this useful? People with me? Fabulous. I'm seeing thumbs up and nods and things like that. Just one more slide. Alice, could you move on to the next one? Oh, I put in some little animations in this one, Alice. So fingers at the ready. So the best way of doing this is to think backwards. So often people start thinking about what they want to do, their activities. What are we going to do right now, without fully thinking through how they're going to get to the kind of big longer term change that they want to have. This kind of thinking process goes by a few different names. You might have heard of something called a theory of change or a logic model. These kind of frameworks are used a lot within the public policy space, but also within international development. But anyway, regardless, often what you want to try and do is think of that big longer term change and then work backwards. So Alice, the first slide, or not first slide, the first bit, the long-term goal. Often it can be really helpful to think about what that long-term goal is. Where do you want to be? What's your vision for your project, whatever that might be? And then you can slowly start to work backwards and think about what the kind of key changes might need to be to get there. So you can start to think about that medium term change. And then if you work backwards even further, you can start to think about the short term change. And that then can really help crystallize exactly what activities you should be focusing on to help kickstart this kind of domino effect, essentially. And that's the last bit, Alice. If you just click once more, there we go. What we do, our activities. So once you've articulated this, this then becomes a really nice, logical, causal pathway, a chain of events, a sequence of things that you anticipate happening. So you've articulated that broader, longer term goal. You've articulated some of the more medium term things that might need to happen in order to achieve that goal. And then there might be some short term change things that need to happen before you even get to the medium term changes. And that's going to dictate what you do in the here and now. So it's a bit of a kind of a planning tool, a planning process, essentially. But it can really help crystallize thinking as to what you want to do. And this, in a way, helps you kind of develop a bit of a more strategic plan for how you want to have an impact. So often what people do is they know what the big, broader, longer term change they want to have is, and they know some useful things they can do in the immediate term, but they haven't really thought through that black box, as it were, in the middle, those short and medium term changes. So they've not done that thinking really to unpick exactly how we're going to get from what we're doing now to that big, broader, longer term change, our vision in the longer term. So working backwards, although it might seem a little nonsensical, is actually a really useful tip and way of doing things. And this essentially is a theory of change. A theory of change, by another name, is basically just an articulation of how you think change will happen. And that, in a nutshell, is kind of what I wanted to share with you, essentially. Just that focus on the longer term goal and the activities. What you're doing in the immediate term is only so useful, but you can try and start mapping out some of those more intermediate steps. And that's going to help you take a more systematic approach to achieving your project's aims and having the impact that you want to have.